Okay guys, today I want to talk with you about something I think everyone has some kind of connection with, and the topic is home office. Home office from an environmental point of view is interesting because I've seen people claiming on the internet that home office reduces CO2 and it should be used as a greenhouse gas reduction measure. So during some of my university projects I've researched home office and the impacts on the CO2 emissions, and I want to now share with you my results, starting with the key takeaways, what I want to show you today. So at first I want you to know the impact of home office, how large it is, how much greenhouse gases are really reduced, and I also want you to know how the home office emissions are composed of, so what plays an important role, what factors are included. And in the end, then we can get to answering the question, under what circumstances is home office reducing greenhouse gas emissions for you if you want to implement it. So starting off with some history, I think everyone knows home office from the time of the COVID-19 pandemic, where it was used to reduce the contacts between people and so reduce the spreading of the coronavirus. So during this pandemic, people started to like working from home, and so we now see the trend that after the measures to reducing contacts are no longer there, we have still the need, or we have still people that want to stay at home and want to work at home because they like the flexibility, they can spend more time with their family, and also other reasons. So this is the current state, but what many people don't know, that home office was firstly implemented in a larger way during the oil crisis, because the idea was, okay, if we have people working from home, we don't have cars on the roads or less commuting, which saves the fuel consumption, or which lowers the fuel consumption. And this, we stay at home, we don't drive our cars, which saves fuel, is basically the same idea which is in mind when we talk about reducing CO2 emissions with home office today. With this idea of, okay, home office could reduce emissions, studies were made. And if we look at the literature, look at the studies, we can see that the majority finds a reduction, some are neutral, some find an increase in emissions, and some are unclear. So if we look at the current literature, there's a trend of that home office could reduce emissions, but what nearly every of the study has in common is that these results based on three factors that determines the CO2 emissions. And the first factor is transportation. I think transportation is like the basic thing everyone thinks of if we talk about home office and the CO2 emissions, because if we don't work at home, if we work at our office place, we drive with, for example, with our car to the office place and back, which is a commuting, and by this transportation method we emit CO2 because we drive our car. If we now stay at home, this eliminates commutes and in turn saves the transport emissions. So we have an emission reduction because we eliminate commutes. But we also have to keep in mind that because we are now at home, we also have to light our homes, we also have to heat our homes or cool our homes, and we also have to power our electronic equipment and our internet connections. So in the end, staying at home increases our energy demand at the private homes during home office. And this is then the second factor determining the CO2 emissions. So we have the transportation and we have the energy. And with these both factors, we get to something I call the basic home office emission equation. Because if we talk about home office and the emissions, it's basically that we reduce emissions by not driving our car. We have a higher energy demand, and higher energy means more CO2, and so the reduction in the transportation sector added with the increase of the energy leads out to our net emissions. In this case, the reduction in the transportation is the same than the increase in the energy sector, but this can change dependent on the conditions. So the reduction in transportation could be greater than the increase in energy demand, but it could also be the other way around, that the increase in energy demand is larger or is higher than the reduced emissions from the transportation. Why is this the case? Why are the net emissions so variable? Starting off with the transportation, so the emissions of the transportation depend on the mean of transportation and also the distance traveled. So if you drive a car and have a long commuting distance, staying at home would reduce more CO2 than if you would go by bike to your work, because it's like 10 minutes away from your home. Then staying at home will not reduce any CO2 emissions because you don't produce any by commuting with your bike. Also, the energy consumption is more complex in detail. So how much energy you consume at your home is determined by your electricity, which is in turn dependent on your energy efficiency, is dependent on what electrical equipment you use, how much internet connection you use, and so on. And because we are interested in the emissions, it's also important to know how large a share of renewable energy is in your electricity mix. We also have to consider heating and cooling, and this is dependent on your location and also the season. So you have to heat more if you live in Scandinavia and we are in the winter. If we are in the spring in Germany, we don't have to heat as much. Or if we are in the hottest summer in Mexico, we have to cool a lot. So it's dependent on your location and the season, and also the insulation of your home, how good it is insulated, and so how much energy you need to keep it warm. Another part affecting the energy consumption is the user behavior, because someone who heats every room, someone who has the light on in every room, someone who watches TV or listens to the radio while working needs more energy than someone who only heats his room he's working in, only lights the room he's working in, and is not using any additional electronic equipment. So this is the side of the energy consumption at your home, but we can also look at the unused workplace, because if we are staying at home, the workplace and our office is not used. And there is the question how this is dealt with. Is the unused workplace, for example, shared with other colleagues? Is it still powered, so is there still heating running, lighting running, and so on? Or is this all turned off, where we can then have like an energy credit because we consume more energy at home, but we also save energy at our workplace. So now that we have talked about transportation and energy in our current literature, we can now dive into the third factor determining the CO2 emissions, which are rebound effects. Rebound effects is just something that affects the net emissions indirectly, and I will show you now some examples, starting off with the transportation. People in home office tend to live further away from the workplace, so they have a lower number of commutes, but their commuting distance is rising, which means extra CO2 for every commute they do. There might also be additional trips, because for example, the school or the supermarket is on the way from your home to the office. But now, because you stay at home, you can't just drive to these locations during your commute, but you have to drive your car just, for example, to pick up your kids or just to buy something from the supermarket. And these are the additional trips that add to the emissions. And also because people live further away during home office, they might also buy more or larger cars for their families. And if you now look closer at the longer distance, another effect it has is that people might live in larger homes, and larger homes mean more energy consumption, which means more emissions if we stay at home. This might also come with higher living expectation, because if you know, okay, I will stay at home for the majority of my work week, I want to have an extra room where I can work. I want to have extra electronic equipment to work more efficiently. I want to have extra furniture, and so these higher living expectations might also lead to a higher energy consumption, or that you have additional emissions because you have to buy new things. This, on the other hand, might also lead to less construction of office buildings, because if people are not needing offices, they don't have to be built. And in the end, the consuming behavior is also important, because if people stay at home, they might have more money because they don't have to buy fuel to commute, and with this money they might also buy more consumer goods, which means more emissions in that case. Now, if we get back with this information to our basic home office equation, we can now stack these factors with the reduction and the increase, we get a graph that looks like this. And this can be plotted as a so-called waterfall chart. Here we can see that transportation decreases emissions, but additional trips and energy consumption increases them. But the unused workplace is shared with somebody, so we have a decrease in emissions here. There's an increase in housing change because we need additional monitors, and there's an increase in consuming behavior, but in the end our net emissions show a decrease. But the diagram like this is very variable, so the results of the reduced emissions also are very variable. So they can look like this, or they could look like this. This is just another scenario. Because there's no general conclusion and the emission change of home office is very dependent on the conditions, I've worked out a best case and a worst case scenario to showcase when home office leads to a reduction in emissions or when home office leads to a increase in emissions. You can pause it here to read the table. We can now back to the waterfall charts. In the best case scenario, we have a long commuting distance which is driven by car, so we have a high reduction in transport emissions. We don't do additional trips, so there's no increase in additional trips, and the energy consumption is also quite low because we have a high energy efficiency and we have a conscious behavior. Also, the unused workplace is shared with some colleagues, so we have some of the benefits here, some reduction here, and also the housing change and the consuming behavior shows only slight increase in emissions. So in the end, that the high transportation with conscious behavior and efficient energy use leads to a high net emission reduction. The worst case, so where the emissions increased a lot, would be where we drive to work typically by bikes. So staying at home doesn't reduce any transportation emissions at all. But we use this extra time to drive our car to additional trips. In addition to that, we have a low energy efficiency and we have a low energy conscious behavior. So this leads to an energy consumption which is quite high. Our unused workplace is still powered, so there's still light on, there's still heating on, there's still the electric equipment on. So we have no energy benefit from our workplace, but there's an increase in emissions from our consuming behavior, and also our housing change shows that we have higher living expectations because we now work more at home. And in this case, we don't have any transportation reduction, which is the biggest reduction during home office, but all the other factors only show an increase. So in this worst case scenario, home office would only lead to an increase in net emissions. But in the end, you have to keep in mind these results are not this black-white and it's very complex. So we now get into the discussion. So first, talking about the implementation. Home office is not suitable for every industry because some factory workers need to be physically in the factory to do their work and they can't do home office. Another thing is that the future development will automatically lead to less emissions. As I have shown, the highest reduction potential leads in the reduce of transportation emissions, which is basically, okay, we don't drive fossil fueled cars. But in the future, if we have more electric mobility, this decrease in emissions is not that significant, so the results might change and the increase in emissions might overtake the reductions. And on the other hand, we have the study procedure. So I want to emphasize the limited scope of the studies and also the different methodologies. Limited scope and different methodologies mean that the studies are not comprehensible, so not everything that might influence the results is included, so they are only a broad way. Like I said, they look at the transportation and the energy, but not in detail, and also how they derive their calculations and how they derive their results is different in each study, so you can't really compare their results. This also shows in the different units in the results. So some say they reduce kilowatt hours, some say they reduce gallons of fuel, some say they reduced CO2 emissions. So you can see that all these studies measure things differently, and also the rebound effects are often not included. And not including them, as I showed you, influences the result significantly. So this leads us to the question of how much does home office really reduces CO2 emissions? The answer to that question is it depends. So the net emissions are very specific of the conditions, so you have a specific evaluation needed to see how much CO2 is reduced, but we calculated and compared the reduction to the German annual greenhouse gas emissions, and our result is that the reduction of home office is less than 1% of the annual German carbon footprint. So in our perspective, the climate impact of home office is comparatively insignificant. So in my opinion, you should base the decision whether you want to work in home office or not more on the personal conditions and the preferences. And if we want to take climate action, we should focus on other sectors and mitigation measures with a higher leverage so that we can more efficiently reduce our emissions with the same expenses. Yeah, going back to the key takeaways, I hope you now understand the impact of home office and how large it really is. I hope you also learned something about the composition of home office emissions and that it is more complex than just we don't drive our car and that leads to a reduction of emissions. And in the end, if you want to implement something from that, I showed you under what circumstances home office can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And with that we are finished for today. As always, I hope you learned something from that. I hope it was kind of interesting for you. Home office is not the big topic in the public discussion, but I think someone will stumble upon that and it would be helpful for someone to have this overview on what is important for home office emissions and what is not. And yeah, that's it. See you next time. Bye, and für die Umwelt.